England in the 15th century stood in the shadow of vanished glory. The absolute triumph of the English crown in France had dissolved, leaving behind an exhausted, politically fractured island. Beneath the facade of chivalric order, immense wealth and military power had concentrated into the hands of a few dominant noble families. These dynastic titans operated beyond the reach of royal justice, commanding thousands of armed retainers bound not by feudal obligation, but by hard currency and liveried loyalty. A kingdom heavily militarized and accustomed to foreign plunder now turned its restless energy inward, lacking only the catalyst of a weak monarch to ignite a conflagration. In the late summer of 1422, the legendary warrior king, Henry V, died of dysentery at the fortress of Vincennes, leaving his massive Anglo-French empire to a 9-month-old infant. King Henry VI ascended the throne as a child entirely dependent on a deeply divided regency council. As the boy grew into adulthood, he demonstrated none of his father's martial prowess or political ruthlessness. He proved pious, deeply averse to conflict, and utterly incapable of imposing his will upon the aggressive warlords of the English peerage. Without a forceful sovereign to enforce the king's peace, a dangerous power vacuum emerged at the very center of the state. Taking advantage of this royal absence, rival magnates began expanding their personal influence through a system known as bastard feudalism. Lords distributed badges and retaining fees to local knights and archers, transforming regional spheres of influence into organized private armies. Feuds over land and inheritance in the remote corners of the realm, particularly between the powerful Percy and Neville families in the north, escalated into open warfare. The royal courts proved impotent. Justice was dictated by whichever lord could march the largest contingent of armed men to the local assizes. This internal destabilization collided with external catastrophe in the summer of 1453. Across the Channel, the English crown suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Castillon, resulting in the final loss of Gascony and the utter collapse of the 100 Years' War. Territories that English monarchs had held for 3 centuries evaporated within a few disastrous campaigns. The military humiliation shattered English prestige. Thousands of battle-hardened soldiers returned to England unpaid, brutalized, and eager for employment in the retinues of the feuding nobles. Simultaneously, the royal treasury was completely drained. Severe economic depression ravaged the countryside as overseas trade plummeted, triggering mass political discontent. Commoners and minor gentry, enraged by heavy taxation and rampant corruption at court, flooded into London in violent uprisings, directing their fury at the king's inner circle who had mismanaged the war effort. The shock of the geopolitical disaster shattered the king. In August 1453, while residing at a hunting lodge in Clarendon, Henry VI suffered a catastrophic mental collapse. Contemporary chronicles report that the monarch lost all sense of his surroundings, unable to walk, speak, or recognize his own family. He slipped into a profound, vegetative stupor that defied all medical treatment. When his queen, Margaret of Anjou, presented him with his newly born heir, Edward of Westminster, the king merely stared ahead, entirely unresponsive to the existence of his own son. The physical embodiment of Lancastrian authority had ceased to function, leaving the central government completely paralyzed. Factional violence, previously contained to isolated skirmishes, spilled from the provinces directly into the royal court as ambitious men scrambled to seize control of the immobilized state. The total incapacitation of the sovereign forced an immediate constitutional crisis. Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, had dominated the king's council and controlled royal patronage for years, but the catastrophic military defeats in France and the king's sudden illness left him highly vulnerable. Against this entrenched court favorite stood Richard, Duke of York. York was the wealthiest landowner in England and commanded a formidable private military apparatus drawn from his vast estates in the Welsh marches. More dangerously for the Lancastrian establishment, York possessed a direct bloodline to the throne. Through his descent from King Edward III's second surviving son, he held a genealogical claim technically superior to the reigning monarch, whose line descended from Edward III's third son. With the realm spiraling into anarchy, Parliament intervened. In March 1454, the Lords of the Realm appointed Richard of York as protector and defender of the realm. York moved swiftly to dismantle his rival's authority. He ordered the immediate arrest of the Duke of Somerset, confining him to the Tower of London without trial. York then installed his political allies, notably his brother-in-law the Earl of Salisbury, into the highest offices of state. For 10 months, the Duke imposed a strict, competent administration, stabilizing the royal finances and suppressing the regional rebellions that had festered under Lancastrian neglect. This fragile stability shattered as abruptly as it began. Around Christmas 1454, King Henry VI suddenly awoke from his catatonic state. He recognized his wife, inquired about his son, and ordered his chaplain to give thanks to God. By early 1455, the monarch had sufficiently recovered his faculties to resume personal rule. Henry immediately dismantled the protectorate. He reversed York's political and financial reforms, released Somerset from the Tower, and restored the Lancastrian loyalists to absolute power. York, stripped of his authority and facing imminent treason charges, recognized that political survival at court was no longer possible. He fled London and rode rapidly toward his strongholds in the north to mobilize his forces. The Duke of York allied himself completely with the powerful Neville family, joining forces with the Earl of Salisbury and his aggressive son, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Together, they raised an army of heavily armed northern retainers and marched south toward the capital. Meanwhile, the king, Somerset, and a hastily assembled royal entourage departed London, moving northwest toward Leicester to summon a great council intended to officially condemn York and his allies. The two forces converged violently on the morning of May 22, 1455, at the market town of St. Albans. Somerset ordered the royal vanguard to construct physical barricades across the narrow streets of the town, positioning the king's banner in the market square. York's army arrived shortly after, halting outside the town boundaries. For several hours, the Duke negotiated through heralds, demanding Somerset be handed over for execution. The Lancastrians refused. Shortly before noon, York ordered the assault. The initial Yorkist frontal attacks against the heavily defended timber barricades suffered severe casualties. The Lancastrian archers held their ground, inflicting heavy losses on the advancing northern infantry. The tactical stalemate broke only when the Earl of Warwick led a reserve contingent of heavily armed men-at-arms through the unguarded gardens and narrow alleyways behind the main thoroughfare. Finding the rear defenses neglected, Warwick's men smashed their way through the timber walls of the civilian houses. They erupted directly into the market square, striking the Lancastrian defenders violently in the flank while sounding their war trumpets. Panic rapidly swept through the royal ranks as the defensive line collapsed. The localized street skirmish degenerated into a brutal, close-quarters massacre amidst the medieval houses and taverns. The Duke of Somerset fought his way out of the Castle Inn, surrounded by Yorkist retainers, and was hacked to death on the cobblestones. The sheer ferocity of the sudden assault overwhelmed the royal bodyguard. Several top Lancastrian commanders, including the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Clifford, were targeted directly and slaughtered where they stood, eliminating York's fiercest northern rivals in a single stroke. Amidst the chaos, a stray arrow struck King Henry VI in the neck, grazing his shoulder and leaving the monarch bleeding and deeply traumatized by the violence swirling around him. Yorkist soldiers stormed a local tanner's shop where the king had been hurried for shelter, seizing his physical person as a prisoner of war. Richard of York entered the darkened shop shortly after, stepping over the armored bodies of the royal guard, and knelt respectfully before the terrified, bleeding sovereign. The dust settled at St. Albans, leaving Richard, Duke of York, holding the captive King Henry VI. York quickly re-established his protectorate in London, seizing control of the royal council and commanding the machinery of government. However, the true resistance to Yorkist dominance no longer emanated from the traumatized monarch. Queen Margaret of Anjou recognized that her husband's authority had become a hollow instrument wielded by his political captors. Stripping the capital of its royal prestige, She abandoned London in 1456 and relocated the entire royal household to the heavily fortified city of Coventry in the Midlands. In Warwickshire, the Queen constructed a shadow administration entirely isolated from Yorkist interference. She distributed the silver swan badge of her young son, Edward of Westminster, to a rapidly expanding network of loyalist knights and regional magnates. Using the extensive revenues of the Duchy of Lancaster, Margaret methodically rebuilt the royal army, filling its ranks with men directly bound to the Lancastrian dynasty. She purged York's appointees from local offices across the region, replacing them with fiercely loyal partisans. The royal court at Coventry functioned as an armed camp, explicitly preparing for a war of annihilation against the men who had slaughtered the king's closest allies. Tensions fractured into open warfare in the autumn of 1459. The Queen ordered Lancastrian lords to converge their retinues on Worcester, effectively surrounding the Yorkist estates in the Welsh marches. Richard of York hastily summoned his political allies, the Earl of Salisbury and the Earl of Warwick, commanding them to bring their provincial armies to his fortress at Ludlow. As the Allied forces united, they found themselves drastically outnumbered by a massive royal host advancing under the king's own banner. The two armies entrenched themselves on opposite banks of the River Teme near Ludford Bridge on October 12, 1459. Before the battle could commence, Lancastrian heralds crossed the river under a flag of truce, offering a royal pardon to any man who abandoned the Yorkist cause. The strategic offer broke the discipline of the rebel army. Under the cover of darkness, Andrew Trollope, a veteran military commander brought from Calais by the Earl of Warwick, defected to the royal camp along with his highly trained garrison troops. Trollope carried vital intelligence regarding York's troop deployments and artillery positions. Realizing their tactical position had completely collapsed, the Yorkist lords made a desperate decision. Leaving their banners flying and their soldiers sleeping in the encampment, York, Warwick, and Salisbury mounted their fastest horses and fled into the night. The abandoned rebel army surrendered at dawn, allowing Lancastrian forces to sack the town of Ludlow. The Duke of York sailed westward, securing refuge in Ireland, where the colonial administration recognized his authority and supplied him with fresh revenues. Meanwhile, Warwick and Salisbury fled south to the English Channel, commandeering a fishing vessel to reach the heavily fortified enclave of Calais. Secure in her triumph, Margaret summoned a vindictive assembly at Coventry in November 1459, known to its detractors as the Parliament of Devils. This parliament passed sweeping acts of attainder, stripping the exiled Yorkist lords of their titles, their lands, and their lives, while officially disinheriting their descendants. The utter confiscation of their English estates left the Yorkists with no option but violent rebellion. From the formidable military bastion of Calais, the Earl of Warwick launched a devastating naval campaign across the Channel. He blockaded the English coast, intercepted royal merchant shipping, and boldly seized the king's fleet anchored at Sandwich. Contemporary chronicles report that Warwick weaponized his maritime supremacy to spread political propaganda across southern England, portraying the Lancastrian government as a corrupt tyranny that oppressed the common people. In June 1460, Warwick launched a highly coordinated amphibious invasion, landing at Sandwich with 2,000 seasoned men-at-arms to reclaim his confiscated birthright. Kentish levies and disenchanted southern gentlemen flocked to Warwick's banner as he marched swiftly toward London. The capital opened its gates without resistance, allowing the Earl to secure the city before turning his reinforced army northward to confront the royal host. On July 10, 1460, Yorkist forces intercepted the king's army entrenched behind flooded defensive earthworks at the Battle of Northampton. Heavy rain sabotaged the Lancastrian artillery, leaving their gunpowder damp and their cannons useless. As Warwick's infantry assaulted the barricades, Lord Grey of Ruthin, commanding the Lancastrian right flank, ordered his men to lay down their weapons and actively helped the attackers breach the defensive line. The treachery triggered a complete collapse of the royal army. Lancastrian defenders were slaughtered as they attempted to flee across the swollen River Nene. The Duke of Buckingham and the Earl of Shrewsbury perished in the desperate melee outside the king's tent. For the second time in 5 years, victorious Yorkist commanders entered the royal pavilion to find King Henry VI sitting alone, immobilized by shock. Warwick escorted the captive monarch back to London with overwhelming military pomp, seizing the machinery of government, while Queen Margaret fled into the Welsh mountains with the young Prince of Wales. News of the spectacular victory reached Richard of York in Ireland. He landed in Wales in September 1460 and marched toward London with a retinue displaying the undifferenced royal arms of England, a bold heraldic assertion of his direct claim to the throne. When York entered Westminster Hall in October, he strode past the assembled peers of the realm and placed his hand upon the empty royal throne, expecting widespread acclamation. Instead, he was met with total silence. The Archbishop of Canterbury nervously asked if the Duke wished to seek an audience with the king. York had drastically miscalculated the political climate. The English nobility remained deeply reluctant to overthrow an anointed monarch, despite his severe political incapacities. Recognizing the lack of support for immediate usurpation, York shifted his legal strategy. He presented Parliament with a detailed genealogical roll proving his senior descent from the Plantagenet line. After weeks of tense, deadlocked negotiations, Parliament engineered an unprecedented constitutional compromise known as the Act of Accord on October 24, 1460. The legislation allowed Henry VI to retain the crown for the remainder of his natural life. However, it explicitly disinherited Edward of Westminster, stripping the boy of his royal birthright. Parliament officially declared Richard of York the Prince of Wales, Lord Protector, and the sole legitimate heir to the English throne. The disinheritance of her only son transformed Margaret of Anjou's political struggle into a fierce maternal crusade. Rejecting the Act of Accord outright, the Queen traveled aggressively to Scotland, where she secured the military backing of the Scottish Crown by officially ceding the vital border fortress of Berwick-upon-Tweed. Armed with fiercely independent Scottish mercenaries, she moved into northern England, rallying the vengeful sons of the Lancastrian lords who had fallen at St. Albans and Northampton. The Duke of Somerset and Lord Clifford raised a massive army of northern retainers, pillaging Yorkist estates across Yorkshire and assembling a lethal striking force intent on entirely obliterating the Duke of York and his political settlement. Facing a rapidly expanding rebellion, Richard of York marched north with a small army in December 1460, intending to pacify the region. He occupied his defensive stronghold at Sandal Castle near Wakefield, but soon found his garrison dangerously undersupplied and surrounded by a vastly superior Lancastrian force. On December 30th, York made a disastrous tactical decision. Foraging parties had reported a vulnerability in the Lancastrian lines, prompting the Duke to sally forth from the impenetrable walls of Sandal Castle and engage the enemy in the open field. The open terrain masked a devastating trap. As York's infantry engaged the Lancastrian vanguard, hidden detachments of heavy cavalry commanded by Lord Clifford emerged from the surrounding woods, enveloping the Yorkist army on 3 sides. The Battle of Wakefield devolved into a merciless slaughter. Richard of York was unhorsed and killed in the brutal infantry clash. The Earl of Salisbury was captured and executed the following day. York's 17-year-old son, the Earl of Rutland, attempted to flee across Wakefield Bridge, but was intercepted and stabbed to death by Clifford, an act of localized vengeance for his own father's death at St. Albans. The victorious Lancastrian lords subjected the fallen Yorkist commander to grotesque posthumous mockery. They severed Richard of York's head, fashioned a derisive crown out of paper and reeds, and nailed it to the wooden spikes of Micklegate Bar, the main southern gate into the walled city of York. The grim physical display stared blindly toward the south, serving as a brutal political warning to any who dared usurp the Lancastrian birthright. Yet, the physical eradication of the Duke did not extinguish the dynastic civil war. Far to the west, in the Welsh Marches, the devastating news of the massacre reached York's 18-year-old son, Edward, Earl of March, who immediately began mobilizing his own provincial army to avenge his father's severed head and seize the throne. The death of Richard, Duke of York, left his faction leaderless, but their military apparatus unbroken. Command of the Yorkist cause immediately transferred to his 18-year-old son, Edward, Earl of March, who was raising formidable forces in the Welsh borderlands. Learning of the massacre at Wakefield, Edward marched swiftly to intercept a Lancastrian force advancing from Wales under Jasper Tudor. On the bitterly cold morning of February 2, 1461, the young commander arranged his troops near the crossroads of Mortimer's Cross. Contemporary chronicles report a striking meteorological phenomenon appearing in the sky before the vanguard: 3 distinct suns shining simultaneously through the freezing mist. Edward rapidly interpreted this parhelion to his terrified soldiers as a divine omen of victory, adopting the sun in splendor as his personal emblem. He then ordered his infantry forward, shattering the Lancastrian lines, executing their captured commanders, and permanently securing his western flank. While Edward triumphed in the west, Queen Margaret of Anjou drove her northern army southward, pillaging towns along the Great North Road to feed her Scottish mercenaries. The Earl of Warwick marched from the capital to intercept her, fortifying the town of St. Albans with experimental gunpowder artillery. On February 17th, Lancastrian forces bypassed Warwick's frontal barricades, navigating through the town's rear lanes to strike the Yorkist flank. The rapid envelopment broke Warwick's defensive line, forcing him to abandon the field and retreat westward. Amidst the chaotic Yorkist withdrawal, the Lancastrians recovered King Henry VI, who was found sitting quietly beneath a tree, entirely unguarded. Despite reclaiming the monarch, Margaret's victorious army found the gates of London firmly barred against them. The city's wealthy merchants, terrified by reports of Lancastrian looting, refused entry, stalling the Queen's momentum long enough for Edward of March and the remnants of Warwick's forces to converge on the capital. Edward rode into London unopposed, presenting himself not as a royal protector, but as the rightful sovereign. On March 4, 1461, at Westminster Hall, he officially usurped the Lancastrian crown, taking the throne as King Edward IV. Edward IV immediately marched his combined forces north to confront the main Lancastrian host. On Palm Sunday, March 29, 1461, the two factions collided on an elevated plateau near the village of Towton. Over 50,000 men engaged in what would become the largest and bloodiest military conflict ever fought on English soil. A blinding snowstorm swept across the battlefield, blowing directly into the faces of the Lancastrian troops. Edward's archers used the fierce tailwind to unleash volleys of arrows at maximum range, stepping back into the blizzard to avoid the blind, short-falling retaliatory fire from their enemies. When the Lancastrians exhausted their ammunition, the Yorkists advanced, plucking the enemy arrows from the snow to fire them back into the dense ranks. Infuriated by the continuous missile bombardment, the Lancastrian vanguard charged blindly up the slope, forcing a brutal, close-quarters infantry melee that raged uninterrupted for 10 exhausting hours. The prolonged slaughter exhausted both armies until late Yorkist reinforcements arrived on the Lancastrian flank, collapsing their defensive lines entirely. The retreat degenerated into a panicked rout as fleeing soldiers drowned in the freezing waters of the Cock Beck, turning the river red with blood. Edward IV secured an absolute tactical victory, decimating the Lancastrian nobility and forcing Henry VI, Margaret, and their young son to flee frantically into exile in Scotland. Over the next 3 years, Yorkist forces systematically eradicated the remaining pockets of Lancastrian resistance in Northumberland. Warwick directed successful siege operations against massive northern fortresses, neutralizing the final armed opposition at Hedgeley Moor and Hexham in 1464. The abandoned rebel army surrendered at dawn, allowing Lancastrian forces to sack the town of Ludlow. The Duke of York sailed westward, securing refuge in Ireland, where the colonial administration recognized his authority and supplied him with fresh revenues. Meanwhile, Warwick and Salisbury fled south to the English Channel, commandeering a fishing vessel to reach the heavily fortified enclave of Calais. Secure in her triumph, Margaret summoned a vindictive assembly at Coventry in November 1459, known to its detractors as the Parliament of Devils. This parliament passed sweeping acts of attainder, stripping the exiled Yorkist lords of their titles, their lands, and their lives, while officially disinheriting their descendants. With the physical threat seemingly extinguished, the Earl of Warwick assumed the role of chief diplomat, traveling to the continent to negotiate a prestigious dynastic marriage between Edward IV and a French princess. His diplomatic authority, however, was suddenly and publicly humiliated. In September 1464, the king summoned his royal council and announced he had already secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of a minor Lancastrian knight, 5 months earlier. Edward aggressively elevated his new wife's extensive, impoverished family, distributing royal titles, marriages, and estates to the Woodville siblings. This sudden influx of favorites effectively blocked Warwick's access to royal patronage, undermining the political dominance of the man who had placed the king upon the throne. Stripped of his absolute influence, Warwick orchestrated a violent armed rebellion against his own sovereign in the summer of 1469. He funded a northern uprising, intentionally drawing the royal army away from the capital, before crossing from Calais with a veteran invasion force. Warwick's retainers intercepted and crushed the king's Welsh reinforcements at the Battle of Edgecote Moor, executing the queen's father and brother. Shortly after the engagement, Warwick's men ambushed King Edward himself, capturing the monarch and placing him under armed guard at Middleham Castle. Warwick attempted to govern the realm by issuing decrees in the captive king's name, but the English nobility flatly refused to obey orders from a prisoner sovereign. Facing widespread aristocratic resistance and a deteriorating security situation across the kingdom, the isolated earl was forced to release Edward IV, superficially reconciling with the monarch before fleeing into exile in France the following year. Arriving at the French court in 1470, Warwick struck an unprecedented political alliance orchestrated and funded by King Louis XI of France. The exiled earl formally reconciled with his most bitter enemy, Queen Margaret of Anjou. To seal the pact, Warwick married his youngest daughter to Margaret's son, pledging to restore the very dynasty he had previously destroyed. Funded by French gold and supported by French naval vessels, Warwick invaded England in September 1470. He landed in Devon and marched rapidly toward London with a massive army. Outflanked and lacking the immediate military support to mount a defense, Edward IV abandoned his kingdom, fleeing across the North Sea to seek refuge in the Duchy of Burgundy. Warwick entered London unopposed and orchestrated the readaptation, releasing the mentally fragile Henry VI from the Tower of London and parading him through the streets as the restored sovereign. Edward IV did not remain in exile long. Securing a loan and a contingent of handgunners from the Duke of Burgundy, he landed on the Yorkshire coast in March 1471. He marched aggressively southward, bypassing hostile forces, gathering local levies, and successfully entering London, where he promptly returned Henry VI to captivity. Warwick pursued the Yorkist army, positioning his forces on the high ground north of the capital near the town of Barnet. At dawn on April 14th, Edward launched a surprise attack in dense, blinding fog. The poor visibility caused catastrophic confusion on the battlefield. Commanding the Lancastrian right, the Earl of Oxford routed the Yorkist flank, but became lost in the mist while returning. His men collided with their own center, who mistook Oxford's radiant star banner for Edward's sun in splendor. The Lancastrians fired upon their own troops, triggering accusations of treason and a complete collapse of their defensive formation. In the ensuing rout, the Earl of Warwick attempted to reach his horse, but Yorkist infantry caught him, pried open his armor, and struck him dead on the field. Exactly as Warwick fell at Barnet, Margaret of Anjou landed on the southern coast at Weymouth with her son and a force of French mercenaries. Upon learning of Warwick's death, she immediately marched her army toward Wales to link up with remaining loyalist forces. Edward IV launched a grueling, forced march across the country, intercepting the Lancastrians just short of the River Severn crossing at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471. Yorkist artillery bombarded the Lancastrian positions before Edward's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, led a decisive flanking maneuver that shattered the enemy line. During the brutal rout, Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, the sole Lancastrian heir, was cut down and killed on the battlefield. Margaret of Anjou was captured shortly afterward, permanently stripped of the son she had fought to crown. Edward IV returned to London in absolute triumph on May 21st. That same night, King Henry VI died violently in the Tower of London, officially recorded as perishing from melancholy, though contemporary historians widely attribute his sudden death to an assassination order from the Yorkist king. Edward IV claimed absolute victory, establishing an undisputed hold on the English throne through blood and military conquest. The king returned to the business of governing, heavily enriching his Woodville in-laws and centralizing royal authority. Simultaneously, he dispatched his intensely loyal younger brother, the Duke of Gloucester, to the Anglo-Scottish border, where the young duke began aggressively expanding his own military retinue and territorial influence over the pacified northern lords. The utter confiscation of their English estates left the Yorkists with no option but violent rebellion. From the formidable military bastion of Calais, the Earl of Warwick launched a devastating naval campaign across the Channel. He blockaded the English coast, intercepted royal merchant shipping, and boldly seized the king's fleet anchored at Sandwich. Contemporary chronicles report that Warwick weaponized his maritime supremacy to spread political propaganda across southern England, portraying the Lancastrian government as a corrupt tyranny that oppressed the common people. In June 1460, Warwick launched a highly coordinated amphibious invasion, landing at Sandwich with 2,000 seasoned men-at-arms to reclaim his confiscated birthright. The destruction of Richard, Duke of York, at Wakefield decapitated the rebel faction, but it did not extinguish their military apparatus. Command of the Yorkist cause immediately transferred to his 18-year-old son, Edward, Earl of March, who commanded formidable forces in the Welsh borderlands, intercepting a Lancastrian army advancing from Wales under Jasper Tudor. The young commander positioned his troops near the crossroads of Mortimer's Cross in early February 1461. As the armies formed their lines in the freezing mist, a rare meteorological phenomenon appeared before the vanguard. 3 distinct suns shining simultaneously in the winter sky. Edward rapidly interpreted this parhelion to his terrified soldiers as a divine omen of victory, adopting the sun in splendor as his personal battle standard. He ordered his infantry forward, completely shattering the Lancastrian lines, executing their captured commanders, and permanently securing his western flank. While Edward triumphed in the west, Queen Margaret of Anjou drove her victorious northern army relentlessly southward, pillaging towns along the Great North Road to compensate her Scottish mercenaries. The Earl of Warwick marched from the capital to intercept her, fortifying the town of St. Albans with experimental gunpowder artillery and heavy barricades. On February 17th, Lancastrian forces completely bypassed Warwick's frontal defenses, navigating through the town's rear lanes to strike the Yorkist flank in a devastating surprise attack. The rapid envelopment broke Warwick's defensive line, forcing him to abandon the field and retreat westward. Amidst the chaotic Yorkist withdrawal, the Lancastrians recovered King Henry VI, discovering the monarch sitting quietly beneath a tree, entirely unguarded. Despite reclaiming the king, Margaret's army found the gates of London firmly barred against them. The city's wealthy merchants, terrified by widespread reports of Lancastrian looting, refused entry and denied them vital supplies. This logistical stalemate stalled the Queen's momentum long enough for Edward of March and the remnants of Warwick's forces to link up and converge on the capital. Recognizing her vulnerable position, Margaret ordered her army to retreat back to the friendly territory of Yorkshire. Edward rode into London unopposed, presenting himself not merely as a royal protector, but as the rightful sovereign. Consolidating absolute political support among the capital's elites, he was officially proclaimed King Edward IV on March 4, 1461, formally usurping the Lancastrian crown. Edward IV immediately marched his newly combined forces north to confront the main Lancastrian host. On Palm Sunday, March 29, 1461, the two massive rival factions collided on an elevated plateau near the village of Towton in Yorkshire. Over 50,000 men engaged in what would become the largest and bloodiest military conflict ever fought on English soil. A blinding snowstorm swept across the battlefield, blowing directly into the faces of the Lancastrian troops. Edward's archers capitalized on the fierce tailwind to unleash volleys of cloth-yard shafts at maximum range, stepping back into the blizzard to avoid the blind, short-falling retaliatory fire from their enemies. When the Lancastrians exhausted their ammunition, the Yorkists advanced, plucking the enemy arrows from the snow to fire them back into the dense ranks. Infuriated by the continuous missile bombardment and taking heavy casualties, the Lancastrian vanguard charged blindly up the slope. The engagement forced a brutal, close-quarters infantry melee that raged uninterrupted for 10 exhausting hours in the freezing snow. The tactical deadlock broke only when late Yorkist reinforcements, commanded by the Duke of Norfolk, arrived on the eastern flank and collapsed the Lancastrian defensive lines entirely. The retreat degenerated into a panicked rout as fleeing soldiers drowned in the freezing, swollen waters of the Cock Beck, effectively turning the river red with blood. Edward IV secured an absolute tactical victory, decimating the Lancastrian nobility on the field and forcing Henry VI, Margaret, and their young son to flee frantically into exile in Scotland. For the next 3 years, Yorkist forces systematically dismantled the remaining pockets of Lancastrian resistance in Northumberland. The Earl of Warwick directed successful siege operations against massive northern fortresses like Bamborough and Dunstanburgh, while his brother, Lord Montague, commanded the frontline troops. Montague intercepted and destroyed the final coordinated Lancastrian insurgencies, neutralizing the armed opposition decisively at the battles of Hedgeley Moor and Hexham in the spring of 1464. With the physical threat seemingly extinguished, Warwick assumed the role of chief diplomat, traveling to the continent to negotiate a prestigious dynastic marriage between Edward IV and a French princess to secure international recognition for the new Yorkist regime. Warwick's diplomatic authority, however, was suddenly and publicly humiliated by his own sovereign. In September 1464, the king summoned his royal council and announced he had already secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of a minor Lancastrian knight, 5 months earlier in May. Edward aggressively elevated his new wife's extensive and ambitious family, distributing prime royal titles, highly lucrative marriages, and massive estates to the numerous Woodville siblings. This sudden influx of new favorites effectively blocked Warwick's access to royal patronage, actively undermining the political and financial dominance of the man who had placed the king upon the throne. Stripped of his absolute influence, Warwick orchestrated a violent armed rebellion against Edward IV in the summer of 1469. He secretly funded a massive northern uprising led by a commander calling himself Robin of Redesdale, intentionally drawing the royal army away from the capital. Once the king moved north, Warwick crossed the Channel from Calais with a veteran invasion force. Warwick's retainers intercepted and crushed the king's Welsh reinforcements at the Battle of Edgecote Moor, immediately executing the Queen's father and brother on the battlefield. Shortly after the engagement, Warwick's men ambushed King Edward himself, capturing the monarch and placing him under armed guard at Middleham Castle. Warwick attempted to govern the realm by issuing decrees in the captive king's name, but the English nobility flatly refused to obey orders from a prisoner sovereign. Facing widespread aristocratic resistance and a rapidly deteriorating security situation across the kingdom, the isolated earl was forced to release Edward IV, superficially reconciling with the monarch before fleeing into exile in France the following year. Arriving at the French court in 1470, Warwick struck an unprecedented political alliance orchestrated and entirely funded by King Louis XI of France. The exiled earl formally reconciled with his most bitter enemy, Queen Margaret of Anjou. To seal the pact, Warwick married his youngest daughter and Neville to Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, pledging his vast military resources to restore the very Lancastrian dynasty he had previously destroyed. Funded by French gold and supported by French naval vessels, Warwick invaded England in September 1470. He landed in Devon and marched rapidly toward London with a massive army. Caught completely off guard and lacking the immediate military support to mount a cohesive defense, Edward IV abandoned his kingdom, fleeing across the North Sea to seek refuge in the Duchy of Burgundy. Warwick entered London unopposed and orchestrated the period known as the Readeption. He released the mentally fragile Henry VI from his confinement in the Tower of London, clothed him in royal robes, and paraded him through the streets of the capital as the restored sovereign. The restoration, however, heavily depended on Warwick's ability to maintain control over a deeply fractured nobility that resented his overwhelming power. Edward IV did not remain in exile long. Securing a substantial financial loan and a contingent of highly trained handgunners from the Duke of Burgundy, he landed on the Yorkshire coast in March 1471. He marched aggressively southward, bypassing hostile forces, gathering local levies, and successfully re-entering London, where he promptly returned Henry VI to captivity. Warwick pursued the Yorkist army, positioning his forces on the high ground north of the capital near the town of Barnet. At dawn on April 14th, Edward launched a surprise attack in dense, blinding fog. The poor visibility caused catastrophic confusion on the battlefield. Commanding the Lancastrian right flank, the Earl of Oxford routed the Yorkist left, but became lost in the mist while returning to the main line. His victorious men collided with their own center, who mistook Oxford's radiant star banner for Edward's sun in splendor. The Lancastrians fired upon their own troops, triggering accusations of treason and a complete collapse of their defensive formation. In the ensuing rout, the Earl of Warwick attempted to reach his horse in the rear lines, but Yorkist infantry caught him, pried open his armor, and struck him dead on the field. Exactly as Warwick fell at Barnet, Margaret of Anjou landed on the southern coast at Weymouth with her son and a force of French mercenaries. Upon learning of Warwick's death, she immediately marched her army toward Wales to link up with Jasper Tudor's remaining loyalist forces. Edward IV launched a grueling, forced march across the country, intercepting the Lancastrians just short of the River Severn crossing at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471. Yorkist artillery heavily bombarded the Lancastrian positions before Edward's forces launched a decisive flanking maneuver that completely shattered the enemy line. During the brutal rout, Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, the sole Lancastrian heir, was cut down and killed on the battlefield. Margaret of Anjou was captured shortly afterward, permanently stripped of the son she had fought decades to crown. Edward IV returned to London in absolute triumph on May 21st. That same night, King Henry VI died violently in the Tower of London, officially recorded as perishing from melancholy, though contemporary historians and political observers widely recognized his sudden death as an explicit assassination order from the Yorkist king. Edward IV claimed absolute victory, establishing an undisputed hold on the English throne through blood and military conquest. The king immediately returned to the business of governing, heavily enriching his Woodville in-laws and centralizing royal authority from Westminster. Simultaneously, he dispatched his intensely loyal younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to the Anglo-Scottish border, where the young duke began aggressively expanding his own military retinue and territorial influence over the newly pacified northern lords. The Yorkist regime projected an image of absolute security following the destruction of the Lancastrian resistance. King Edward IV commanded the wealth of the realm, possessed healthy male heirs, and controlled the powerful provincial magnates. This stability evaporated in April 1483 when the king contracted a sudden illness and died unexpectedly at the age of 40. He left the English throne to his 12-year-old son, King Edward V. Under the terms of his father's will, the boy's paternal uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector to govern the realm during the king's minority. However, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and her extensive family immediately moved to bypass Gloucester's authority. Operating from London, the Woodville faction attempted to crown the young monarch quickly, aiming to dominate the royal council and maintain their lucrative grip on state patronage before the Lord Protector could establish his administration. Gloucester acted preemptively to dismantle the Woodville faction and secure his designated authority. Leaving his formidable power base in Yorkshire, he rode rapidly south, coordinating a rendezvous with his political ally, the Duke of Buckingham. Gloucester intercepted the young king's entourage as it traveled from the Welsh marches toward London. Meeting the royal party at the town of Stony Stratford in late April, Gloucester ordered his men-at-arms to arrest Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, alongside the king's half-brother, Richard Grey. The Lord Protector dismissed the royal escort, took physical custody of the 12-year-old sovereign, and personally escorted him into the capital. Following royal tradition, Gloucester placed Edward V in the royal apartments of the Tower of London to await his formal coronation. Facing the sudden collapse of her family's political power, Elizabeth Woodville fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her daughters and her younger son, Richard, Duke of York. Under intense pressure from the royal council and armed retainers surrounding the abbey, she eventually surrendered the younger prince, who joined his brother within the fortress walls. With the military occupation of the capital secured and the royal heirs under lock and key, Gloucester systematically eliminated the remaining opposition. On June 13th, he convened a council meeting at the Tower and suddenly accused Lord Hastings, a fiercely loyal Yorkist who resisted the Protector's expanding ambitions, of treason. Gloucester's armed guards dragged Hastings onto the Tower Green and summarily beheaded him on a block of rough timber. Following this brutal purge, the planned coronation of Edward V was abruptly cancelled. A coalition of northern lords and pliant clerics mobilized to alter the line of succession. On June 22nd, sermons preached at St. Paul's Cross publicly declared the princes illegitimate. Shortly afterward, Parliament convened and issued a legal petition known as the Titulus Regius. This document proclaimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was legally invalid due to a prior marital pre-contract with another noblewoman. Parliament ratified the petition, officially stripping the young princes of their right to inherit the crown. Acting upon this legislative mandate, the Duke of Gloucester accepted the throne, crowning himself King Richard III on July 6, 1483. The constitutional usurpation triggered immediate unrest, severely exacerbated by the unknown fate of the deposed children. Throughout the early summer, London citizens observed the two young princes playing in the gardens of the Tower. By late summer 1483, the boys withdrew deeper into the inner apartments, and their appearances behind the barred windows ceased entirely. Contemporary chronicles record that the boys vanished from public record, sparking widespread political outrage and pervasive rumors of royal assassination. This intense public backlash ignited a formidable armed uprising in October 1483. The rebellion was notably orchestrated not by Lancastrian remnants, but by disillusioned Yorkist establishment figures, including Richard III's former chief political architect, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham raised forces in Wales and the West Country to depose the king, coordinating his movements with exiled dissidents. However, torrential autumn rains flooded the River Severn, completely halting Buckingham's advance and preventing his troops from linking up with southern insurgents. Richard III mobilized his royal army, swiftly crushed the isolated rebel contingents, captured Buckingham, and ordered his immediate execution for treason. Buckingham's failed revolt forced the surviving English dissidents to look across the Channel for an alternative claimant. They found him in Henry Tudor. Henry possessed a faint, legally questionable Lancastrian bloodline through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, but the usurpation of Richard III left him as the only viable male alternative to the current regime. Having spent 14 years living as a political refugee in the courts of Brittany and France, Tudor successfully secured financial backing and military support from the French crown. On August 7, 1485, Henry Tudor's invasion fleet crossed the Channel and dropped anchor at Mill Bay on the Pembrokeshire coast of Wales. He disembarked with a small, disparate force consisting of 2,000 veteran French mercenaries and a core group of exiled English nobles. Raising the Red Dragon banner of his Welsh ancestors, Tudor marched inland. He utilized his regional heritage to recruit powerful local landowners, notably securing the allegiance of the influential Commander Rees A.P. Thomas, which substantially augmented his army as he marched eastward toward the English border. Richard III rode out from Nottingham Castle to crush the invasion, summoning the martial strength of the kingdom to his banner. The two rival armies converged on August 22, 1485, south of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Henry Tudor commanded approximately 5,000 men, relying heavily on the tactical experience of his French pike formations commanded by the Earl of Oxford. Richard III fielded a substantially larger royal army of nearly 10,000 retainers, deploying his heavy artillery and massed infantry along the crest of Ambion Hill. A third, independent force commanded by Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley hovered ambiguously on the periphery of the battlefield. Commanding nearly 4,000 men, the Stanleys refused to commit to either sovereign, waiting to see which side gained the tactical advantage. The battle commenced with a brutal infantry clash in the marshland at the base of the hill. The Earl of Oxford successfully maneuvered Henry's vanguard through the Fun, engaging the royal front line in fierce, close-quarters combat. Observing Henry Tudor isolated with a small cavalry bodyguard behind the Lancastrian lines, Richard III recognized an opportunity to end the war with a single decisive strike. The king lowered his visor, marshaled his heavy household cavalry, and charged directly down the hill. Richard's horsemen smashed into Tudor's defensive ring with devastating force. The king unhorsed the Lancastrian standard-bearer, William Brandon, killing him instantly, and fought his way within feet of his rival. At this critical moment, Sir William Stanley finally abandoned his neutrality. Stanley ordered his men to charge into the flank of the royal cavalry, enveloping the king's isolated detachment. Richard III was pulled from his horse, overwhelmed by enemy infantry, and struck down by halberds in the mud, becoming the last English monarch to die in combat. Victorious soldiers retrieved the battered royal circlet from a hawthorn bush near Richard's fallen body, placing it upon Henry Tudor's head on the battlefield. The victor marched directly to London to secure the state treasury, date his reign from the day before the battle to legally attainter his enemies, and convene a new parliament. Fulfilling a political pledge made during his exile, King Henry VII arranged a marriage designed to permanently bind the warring factions. On January 18, 1486, he married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, physically uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York into a single heraldic Tudor badge. To ensure the survival of his new dynasty, the monarch dispatched his sheriffs into the provinces, dissolved the private armies of the remaining nobility, and began constructing a formidable centralized bureaucracy that systematically stripped the English peerage of its independent military power. If history fascinates you, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting to be told.